a group of scholars and experts in very different fields, from arts and literature to history and philosophy and theology. Did I miss anything? Who are all invited because they might have an interesting perspective, something to say. And it can be anything. And you all are not required to come up and give a long speech, but you're all invited to say what you have to say. And do you want to start? Great.
Should I go and sit down?
I'm Gísli Sigurðsson, and I have been working with the Eddas and Völuspá in particular, and not perhaps from this the perspective of reception in modern times, but thank you very much, Rune, for inspiring and talk that, of course, covers a wide range of themes and topics and ideas that I would not be qualified to dwell on everything there, and I totally agree and would be the first person to jump on that wagon that Völuspá is, of course, relevant for our times, as it has been for all times, ever since it was written down in the 13th century, and had been by then for quite a long time before. And I'm not so convinced about the necessarily the Fimbulvetur or the climatic disaster that may be or has been postulated as a possible source of inspiration for the particular poem of Völuspá, or I'm not either working with the idea that Völuspá is a poem coming from the late 10th century. I think that narrows down everything that the poem has to mediate, and we know that apocalyptic ideas are very old in many cultures, and the vocabulary in Völuspá is clearly influenced just by biblical translations when the poem is written in the 13th century. So there are many complications with narrowing down the poem to either these climatic minor ice age or the late 10th century. But I don't think that affects the overall approach in your talk, and also the idea that we have a lot to learn from mythologies around the world, that we have anthropological observations and studies of, and they can tell us how this mythological thinking that we have remains of in our old or medieval texts. They can throw light on how people were thinking and visualizing the world around them. But trying to use the culture that flourished here in Iceland in the 9th and 10th century for in the climate change debate now is perhaps overestimating their environmental and sustainability, because we know that the first thing they did was to erase the walrus population in the country, and the next step was to graze the country so that the birch forest disappeared, and what the sheep didn't eat up, they burned down themselves for charcoal. So when a huge Viking exhibition was put up organized by the Smithsonian Institute in year 2000, the environmental devastation of the Norse culture when it moved out into the North Atlantic was the main theme. So both here in Iceland and in Greenland. So that I think I have strong reservations about using it in that context, and that brings us perhaps to the general idea that Viking culture, Norse mythology, and so on, has been used and abused by ideologies other than ours. The Nazis of Germany, of course, are the worst example. But using texts of old for political purposes in the present can be very tricky. It can be they can be an inspiration, of course, And when we have a good cause to fight for, like the climate change, then perhaps we are more inclined to make excuses, but there are still dangers involved here. And that doesn't change the fact that, and literary analysis have also been published now about the discourse around climate change, which uses quite a lot, and as Terry Gunnell was going on about, and you mentioned that the discourse about climate change uses the apocalyptic literature of both the Bible and which Völuspá is one reflection of. So we are somehow inclined to think about catastrophic events in the future with the vocabulary of the literature that has been handed down to us. So that, I think, is just one way that we have of expressing ourselves and understanding the world we live in is through the mythology that well, not only the Norse culture, but the cultures around the globe provide us with. Because I often think that, and that's the point I make in the context of philosophy, that mythologies contain an analysis of human behavior and the state of power politics and conflicts in the world that are equally profound and important and meaningful as philosophical analysis can be. They are just presented in a different way. And I think that sort of sums up the main points I had, but so a few reservations, but a very inspiring way of treating the modern problems at hand, to use the past in a constructive way, shall we say. Thank you.
Yeah, hi everybody. I'm Vidar Hreinsson. I'm originally a literary scholar, and I don't know exactly what I am anymore, but I've been dealing with literary history, cultural history, and recently mainly environmental humanities and eco-criticism. Thank you, Rune, for this just wonderful and inspiring talk. This is, it's always wonderful to see such an kind of creative recreation of old material in a very creative and innovative way, and also breaking out of some old footprints. So. And I actually agree with Gisli's reservations that you always have to be a little bit careful, but you have to be, or you also have to be creative and bold, daring. That you have to dare to do something, to say something that has some meaning. But of course, the current emergency situation is a kind of a common reference for all of us who are here, and so it's wonderful to have this approach to Völuspá. So it's a very old text, but there's a key sentence in the introduction text on Facebook, the introduction to this event, and I quote: "The agenda of modernist epistemology of disembodying minds and deanimating matter." And this is a very strong sentence that covers a lot. And the current or mainstream epistemology is based on fragmentation, and that's what Rune is calling rupture. And actually, he put up a picture of our favorite scapegoat in this issue, Descartes, who is a kind of today's the modern favorite scapegoat for the rupture, for the fragmentation, for the mechanist world picture that we have had over the last few centuries. And so this is about a kind of a fragmentation of the object. The knowledge we have and we create in modern times is based on fragmentation. And the knowledge is thus fragmented. And it's all based on the mechanistic worldview that Descartes developed. But luckily, and of course, Rune's approach to Völuspá is an example of that, that we are experiencing a very strongly increasing revolt against this mechanistic fragmentation. And we can hope for some kind of dynamic, creative paradigm shift in terms of knowledge. And there are a few keywords that I've been encountering over the last few years and I'll mention a few of them. Well, I'll start with my favorite line of poetry. It's by the American Icelandic poet Bill Holm, who was a wonderful poet, and he lived in Iceland every summer for years until he passed away in 2009. And this line goes like this. It's the first line of a poem called Bird Poetry on Skagafjörður. Seabirds arrange themselves in a sentence on the water. And this is so wonderful because the poem is about this sentence that we will never fully understand. And we will never fully understand nature, what it is, and we will never understand its forces. But keywords like Rune was talking about connectivity, relationality, and so on. And everything connects is one of those keywords. A process, like that was first, I think it was first Alfred North Whitehead that came up with that. More than human world, David Abram, and all kinds of studies in diversity that's based on differences. And even within physics, flow and entanglement, that's a concept that Karen Barrett comes up with from Niels Bohr, who was Danish. And we have biosemiotics and the term Umwelt, and complexity is an increasingly discussed term, and of course complexity is a kind of a key word in the entire climate studies, because in the climate studies is actually a kind of a coordination of a huge variety of scientific disciplines that are gradually coordinated, and so that's so the diversity, the complexity is really important there, and maybe the most important term is, in a way, dialogue, and the importance of creating transdisciplinary dialogues between scientific discourses, between fields, between science, humanities, social sciences, and arts, and simply people's common experiences. So these are all important concepts that I think relate very well to what Rune has been talking about. And there's one concept more that I want to mention, and that's growth. And that's simply because capitalism has simply stolen the word growth and reduced it to economic growth, which is, of course, a very serious theft that we have to regain the word and regain some kind of meaning of the word that really makes sense. So I think these keywords will serve as a guidelines for scholars and scientists in the near future, and the dialogues are the only way to join forces against all those apocalyptic threats that we're dealing with. And so that's why I really welcome, I think Rune's approach to Völuspá is very well in accordance with that. But I just want to finish with one thing about Snegluhalli, the guy that Rune was mentioning in the beginning. Snegluhalli he mentioned him because of somebody making fun of the Danes not being able to deal with Drottkvæð poetry. But Snegluhalli was actually a kind of a prankster, trickster, like Loki, like the raven. And actually, I just want to mention that I really like this idea of using the raven as a symbol. Symbols can be really dangerous, but not if we use them in a dynamic, creative way and with an appropriately open meaning. And actually, I've been having a project at the Natural History Museum for now 2 summers, having 2 students gather all kinds of information about ravens, one biologist and one from cultural studies, and this will result in something interesting. I hope so. I hope in a few years. But Snegluhalli was a prankster, a trickster, and there's a wonderful tale about him in Flateyjarbók, where he was a little bit obscene. He had some pornographic comments about some Norwegian queens and so on and so on. And since Rune showed us a picture of a guy with porridge, then it was said that probably Snegluhalli, he died in a pot of porridge at the end, you know. So I just want to say thank you, Rune. This was really inspiring, and I hope we'll have a good and lively discussion here. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. I am Sigríður Guðmarsdóttir. I am the theologian in this group. So I come from the Theology and Religious Studies department, and I have recently been appointed to a position there as an assistant professor in practical theology. And my background is that I went to the US to study for a degree in ecological theology, and then found out that I needed to do something, I need to do research about creation and the creator and the relationship between the two. So I worked a bit with eco-philosophy, and so I did a degree both in philosophy and theology. And I have recently moved back from Norway. I lived in northern Norway in Tromsø for a while, and was teaching there at a Norwegian university. And at that time, I became very interested in indigenous thought, and worked a bit with Sami religion and worldviews, and studied a little bit of North Sami as well. So my reflections here today is as a theologian, as someone who is deeply interested in the relationship between practical thought and theoretical thought and how they connect. And also someone who has done a little bit of study of religion, and someone who is deeply invested in ecological thought. So I want to start by thanking you, Rune, for an inspiring lecture. And it was interesting to listen to you and the way in which you combine the your studies, your anthropological studies around the world, and the way in which you talked about animism, and how you are trying to recover your own tradition, if I understand you correctly, and using your scholarship as a tool to open up those ancient traditions, not only for you personally, but for people that experience climate change now. Am I right in explaining your project in this way? So, some reservations, or at least something you might think about that might help you on your way further. I'm wondering a bit about the method, because what you are basically doing is that you are taking anthropological research of religions, and then you move from there to texts, and so it's the humanities part of me that immediately when you did the jump from the way in which you worked as an anthropologist and someone who's doing religious studies, and went into interpreting old texts, that you're doing a jump there, and I didn't quite get your reflection on that when you went from the methods of social sciences to the methods of the humanities, which is always about hermeneutics, about the interpretation of texts. So I would like you to describe a little bit more this jump. One of the reasons why this is very important to me is that being invited to this panel gave me the opportunity to read Völuspá once more as Völuspá, not as Nordic mythology. And I believe that most of us who are born and raised in this country, we have a very intimate and deep relationship to Nordic mythology. We learn it early on, and it's a part of our early education, and perhaps the way in which our imagination has been formed, and is also a great part of our national identity. And identities are built around stories, and that's why it's always helpful when someone addresses those national myths from another perspective. It's also very difficult, because in some way you can't talk about those myths if you don't speak Icelandic, or something like that. You get defensive because it connects us to our national myths, which I find interesting in many ways. Okay, I'm jumping a little bit to and fro here. Yes, I was saying one of the reasons why I'm interested in this is because I was able to read Völuspá again, and read it slowly, and think about all the things that are not there. And because I studied Völuspá, and then I read Snorra Edda, and I've read it many, many, many times, and I have never really tried to sort out what it is that Snorri tells me and what it is that Völuspá tells me. And a lot of what the way in which you interpreted the Nordic mythology comes from Snorri. the way in which Snorri tells us that Völuspá works. And this is what I say, why I was so occupied with interpretation, and then you have another layer of interpretation, and every time you get a new layer, there is someone who tells you how you think about the old texts. And it's similar with the Bible, since I'm a theologian, that when you look into the first chapter of the Bible, and you try to find the apple that Eve bit in, and you never find it because it's not in the text. And there are many more examples of this. You think there is an apple there, because 2,000 years of biblical scholarship have told you that there is an apple there, but in fact it's not. And it's a little bit the same with Völuspá, that all the things you think are in the text are maybe something that Snorri has provided us with from other traditions, other works that work with Nordic mythology, but also from a Christian perspective, as Gísli reminded us earlier. And Gísli also mentioned apocalypticism. There's this dramatic view of looking at the end of the world. And both Viðar and Gísli spoke about that apocalypticism and using mythology is both wonderful, and it creates new narratives, and it's also dangerous. And my doctoral mother, Catherine Keller, who was an American theologian, she wrote a book in 1999, which was called Apocalypticism Now and Then, A Feminist Guide to the End of the World. It's a great book. And one of the things that she does there is that she distinguishes between apocalypse and then neo-apocalypse and counter-apocalypse, which is that a lot of the interesting stuff that you see in contemporary discourse is a neo-apocalypse, where you use this old discourse in a new way. For example, in the ecological discourse. And then counter-apocalypse, in her terms, is how you remain, that you have an ambiguous relationship to the way in which you use this kind of rhetoric, because it so quickly distinguishes between us and them, and it can become very violent. So it has a shadow side. The raven is an ambiguous symbol also in Christian tradition. In Iceland, you have many stories of the raven, and the raven, for example, there's an old story that says that God pays for the raven. You remember that one, about that there were children who were good to the ravens and gave the ravens some food, and the ravens got them away from the farm where they were living, and then everyone else died. I think it was an avalanche, something like that. In some versions of this story, it is the plague that comes over the farm, and everyone dies in the entire vicinity, but the raven and God are friends in that matter, and the raven is someone that you should be kind to in this folklore. Let me see. I have some more. As you see, this is not coherent in any way. These are just my reflections while listening to you. But I wanted to talk a little bit more about Christianity. Not surprising, since I'm the theologian, and because you said that you wanted to use those old stories, and in some ways they have always been used and they have been reinterpreted. Two examples is the interpretation, many interpretations in Christianity, And also, for example, in this country, that we have a denomination, a formal denomination of Ásatrú, and in Iceland, Ásatrú and this congregation is not connected to white supremacy. So it's very different from for example, in the U.S. and also in Scandinavia, where the Ásatrú assemblies have often been very much connected to white supremacy. So it's good to know that they are much more eco-friendly and for equality, and so there are a lot of good feminists there. But the way in which Nordic mythology was reinterpreted by Christianity, it shows that Christianity never really rid itself from the myths, at least not in this country. And for example, Yggdrasil was reformulated as the tree of life, the biblical tree of life, and also as Christ the vine. And there have also been connections between Odin hanging on the tree for nine days and nights, and then Christ hanging on the tree. And the most famous of those reinterpretations is that in Scandinavia, during the time of the religious change, you always talked about the white Christ, which was a reference to Baldur, of course, and the way in which Baldur unjustly died because of trickery. I want to end by talking a little bit about the language for the North, because this is something that is a part of my own research, that I'm very interested in North and the way in which we can religiously speak about the North. And I have been, because I think that the North needs very much of a care now, because it's more vulnerable than many other places. And it's quite true that it is perhaps more the Pacific Islands that are bearing the brunt of the climate crisis now, but the glaciers in the far north are also melting so quickly, and the indigenous peoples of the far north are also paying the price of climate change. For example, the Sami people. And so I think it is very important that people in this location and in this time take great care of how we speak about the North and how we can put the North to the front right now. And I think it's our responsibility as Northerners to do so. And it has come as a surprise when I started to do a little bit of research on the North, how little positive can be said in Christianity about the North. And for example, if I look to the manuscripts of from the early 13th century, that is about the year 1200, the one that is called Messuskýringar. It has very much to say about that all pulpits should be posed in the North, and there you should both read the gospel and then preach the sermon to the North. And it's because the devil lives in the North. This Messuskýringar manuscript says the devil lives in the North, all the demons, and it's the place of death and darkness. And perhaps because of this, this is not the only source. There are a lot of sources about that the North is a very dangerous place. But perhaps because of this, Christian liturgy does not have many positive things to say about the North. We speak a lot about the East because the East is the place where the sun comes up. So the East is always a symbol of Christ and the resurrection. We speak a lot about the sun on the south, less about west, and especially not about the north. So if Christian religion is not demonizing the north, at least it's ignoring it. And I find that a little bit scary, that it does so. So I started to read the Nordic mythology again. And there also, and now I'm referring to Snorri, Snorri also speaks about Hel as a place where you go north and then down. And the north is not a very good place for Snorri as well. And Snorri is, of course, speaking to us from the 13th century, and is very much has all this Christian religion in his marrow. But when I read Völuspá, when I'm trying to look at the directions in Völuspá, and this is also a part of animism, which is always very localized. So how you orient yourself, how you place yourself is important for animism. And so there are some nasty stuff there about the north as well, especially in verse 38 and 39 and 40, where you see about the place, sá hún standa sólu fjarri. It's náströnd. I cannot remember the English word for it, but it's a nasty place, and it is a house, and the door is open to the north, and there are drops of poison that go in, and the entire house is wrapped by worms. So not a very nice place. But it is also interesting, and this is something that Snorri reminds us, that after Ragnarök, Gimli is obviously the best place to be. But there is also another place, and that is Brimir, which is in Ókólnir, the place that never gets cold. And this place is situated in the north. So for me, who is so trying to be very friendly to the north, both from the religious, from the Christian tradition and perhaps from a comparison of different texts, I find it amazing that the second best place to be after the Ragnarök is Ókólnir. Finally, I want to thank you for inspiring my imagination and giving me the opportunity to go back to those dear texts, to the elements. And in Northern mythology, according to Völuspá, you only have two elements: the ice and the fire, the water and the fire. And ask you really wanted to do a ritual. You told us about that you really wanted to pour the ale into the earth and ask the spirits of Iceland to guide you in this. And I encourage you to do that. And I would like to be there with you.
Yes, my name is Sigríður Þorgeirsdóttir. I come from philosophy, and I want to talk about the topic today from a philosophical perspective, and in the end I will address your presentation more precisely. But I want to begin to talk about what Völuspá has to do with the present-day Me Too movement, and how that further relates to the environmental predicament we find ourselves in. Völuspá is a poem about the end of the world due to human greed, strife, and warring that leads to destruction. At the same time, Völuspá is a poem about the end of heathen culture in the course of Christianization. The oral tradition, which women had a large role in sustaining, is replaced by a written and scholarly tradition from which women were excluded. The silencing of the feminine tradition takes place with the submerging and sinking of the vulva into the depths of the sea. This shift marks simultaneously a shift from nature to culture because the vulva comes from the wilderness, which is from the perspective of the new culture, a place of chaos and unruliness. From my contemporary perspective, over a millennium later, the vulva represents a necessary rewilding of thinking that has disconnected us from ourselves as earthly beings. We need to rewild thinking in order to overcome oppositional ways of thinking that lead to war and destruction, both against each other and against the earthly foundation of our species. Underlying the war against the heathen culture is a war against women and a feminine wisdom tradition, like Helga Kress has convincingly argued in her well-known interpretations of Völuspá and other texts in ancient Nordic sources about vulvas. Now, what does this have to do with the present-day Me Too movement? The vulva represents birth and rebirth of earthly life and stands in the tradition of feminine goddess figures of natality and femininity. This has similarity to the fate of the goddess Sophia we philosophers profess to love, but have disconnected ourselves from by thinking of Sophia as mere theoretical wisdom. We have castrated Sophia. Her sex has been violated. Thereby, we have created the illusion that abstract knowledge is something that is the product of our human intelligence only and is not embedded in earthly roots of our being. A wrong reading of Descartes shows that this is all tied, abstract and earthly. A better reading than the cliché reading that Vida referred to. All creative thinking, practical and theoretical, has roots in deeper sources of our cognition, for we are embodied beings. We know for sure, we really sense it, that our environmental problems cannot only be solved by mere pragmatic abstract rationality, like economic capitalist thinking of curbing and decreasing carbon emissions. We know that we can rewild our thinking by attending more to our lived experience of being in the world with other living beings, human and non-human. And I would suggest we can do it all now by just noticing our breathing while we're sitting here. That's the beginning of rewilding. As a matter of fact, the vulva addresses all of us in the opening lines of the poem. Hljóðs allar helgar kindir. All beings are helgar, are sacred. One of the ancient meanings of sacred is sucking breast milk and being nourished by Mother Earth. The word kindir not only refers to children, but also to kinship. We are kin, but greed based on comparative and hierarchical thought has led to divisions and destruction. Men fight each other. The best of men, the god Baldur, is killed by his brother. That shows how a masculine culture that has disabled and repressed feminine culture is bound to be doomed. It is self-destructive, leading to androcide and femicide. Baldur has similarity with Christ insofar he has feminine and earthly features, but these features succumb to a harsher form of warring and disconnected masculinity. The vulva represents memory, also the memory of wounds that have been inflicted upon us as a species and as a gender, and as beings that are interconnected with all living. The Me Too movement reveals the feminine wound. The wound is being uncovered and comes into the light of day, allowing light and air to heal it. Let us stay with the wound and really try to perceive it, what it must be like to carry the wound, to come to the fore and show it, what effort and courage it takes to show that we are vulnerable and sense into what it does to us, and what it feels like to begin a healing process of this wound. What has it felt like to have been repressed or to be on the side of the repressor? Why have the sexes been in opposition towards one another? And why has the repression of the feminine led to ways of thinking about our place in the world that has disassociated us from the living and the earth? And how can we unwind this? The Völuspá gives us a clue with one of her last statements. Sér hún upp koma öðru sinni, jörð úr ægi, iðja græna, fjalla fossar, flýgur örn yfir, sáur á fjalli fiska veiðir. Symbolically, the eagle may represent abstract theoretical wisdom, and the fish in the stream may represent earthly embodied wisdom. And both forms of wisdom have been associated with male and female respectively. Here the eagle is fishing for this wisdom. The eagle, like the vision of the earth, that has created theoretical and scientific wisdom, needs to dip into and connect with its very sources in the earth, in the water, the living that thinks in and through us. So that's when I want to get back to your paper. You talk about being an animist, but then you felt like embarrassed. You didn't want to do the beer thing. And I think there is a way of, and then you showed some playful examples. And I think there can be a connection between scholarly scientific thinking and earthly thinking that is not only ritualistic, but is truly in a more deeper, profound way scientific, and that is thinking with the living. It's based on cognitive, contemporary cognitive sciences, and we are going there in philosophy, reviving Sophia and the Völuspá.
Yes, hello. My name is Auður Aðalsteinsdóttir, and I'm a literary scholar, and I have a postdoc position now at ROCS, which is a research center on the ocean, climate and society. And last week I spoke with an anthropologist, Danish Niels Bubant, about this event, and he said he was wary of the use of the term animism because of its problematic history within anthropology. That it has been used as a label by Western scholars to describe primitive societies, infantilizing them even, and idealizing the relationship with nature, which might in fact be no less exploitative than ours. So, and also I've been reading Timothy Morton, and he is also saying that in today's reality we cannot return to animism, or rather that it would have to be a new kind of animism. We always have to use this term with reservation. But I come from literary theory, and we're not very afraid of using the word animism. It's a little bit different than in anthropology. But I think also it was Timothy Morton that said that art objects are the only objects which modern society has been willing to acknowledge as having a life of their own, as talking to us, as having something to say. And in the arts and literature, animism has always survived. And in Iceland, we have Þorbjörgur Þórðarson, who Viðar Hreinsson has studied. And lately, Gyrðir Elíasson has been writing about artists who live alone in nature and interact with it. For example, listening to the music of stones. And I have also been studying how the ecofeminism of the 1980s and 1990s prepared the ground for much of contemporary eco-critical thought and environmental literature, with its focus on injustices based on gender, race, class, species, and the systematic exploitation of the environment, and how this is all interconnected. And in the times of climate change, such a viewpoint is extremely important, for global warming demands that we consider the larger planetary context and solutions that touch on every aspect of our existence, and also the spiritual aspect of our existence, which might have been neglected. What I want to point out here is that in Icelandic ecofeminist literature and scholarship, ecofeminist emphasis became thoroughly entangled with the reworking of Nordic mythology. And Sigrid, you talked a little bit of this, how in the 1980s and 1990s, Helga Kress reinterpreted Nordic mythology and many of the Edda poems as revolving around the theme of the founding of society by conquering untamed and wild nature, not least through language and the process of naming, presenting man's victory over nature, wisdom, and women. And Völuspá she interprets as depicting not only the end of the world, or the heathen world, as it is sometimes read, but also the end of heathen women's culture, with the transformation of nature into weapons as a central theme, but also a final vision of a new and better world. So in literature, I want to name Svava Jakobsdóttir's novel Gunnlaðar Saga from 1987, which builds on the idea of ancient goddess worship and of patriarchy stealing the power of women. Gunnlaðar Saga ends with a reference to Völuspá, a hope of a new and different world. And just this year, Haukur Ingvarsson published a poem collection called Men Who Love Men, where he also ends with a poem referring to the writings on Ragnarök. Now, I don't know how much he takes from Völuspá and how much he's taken from Snorri, but he has these themes in the last poem. And he is, for example, linking the binding of the Fenris wolf with the taming of nature, molecules, and DNA, and also moving the focus in the same poem from Men Who Love Men, which one aspect of this Men Who Love Men theme is how history is the story written by men about men, for example. And he moves the focus from men and to women and the relationship between men and women in this last part. So we might say that the reworking of this myth of Ragnarök and also of Völuspá has been central in Icelandic literature's engagement with environmental issues and not least with a gendered perspective. So that was my conclusion.
My name is Mira Leifsdóttir, and I have a background from art and also environmental studies, and I work for the Institute for Sustainability Studies. It's a bit terrifying to speak after so many wise comments here. And also so many things that have been said, but I'm just going to reflect a bit from kind of effect on your really interesting talk, Rune. And I have so many notes here now, but I think you've mentioned the word interconnectedness so even more times than I do, like in general. So I want to speak a little bit about that and how it has to do with compassion, which is a topic that I am very interested in relation to climate change and global challenges and how to mitigate them almost in an emotional way. because to use compassion as a mitigating process, we need to recognize this complexity you were speaking about. Because if we only feel connectedness to what is what we can identify with, we will just create polarization, which is what is happening to a very large extent right now. And but to recognize the fragmentation and all these contradictory narratives which you shed light on in your talk, we can also find a connection to what is also alien to us. So that's yes. And it's also, you know, have to collect my thoughts here. It's also interesting that we, many of us, and now I'm like making excuses for being like having too fragmented thoughts, but then we're all talking about complexity and fragmentation and you know, counter activity to fragmentation is like this, embracing the complexity. So I'm just gonna give myself this space to collect these thoughts. Yes, because also when we stop, or if we look at these narratives in Völuspá and all, and from the context as you both were talking about the gender context, and you were talking about the tricksters who are not actually, you know, either good or evil, but both at the same time. We also might understand that this complexity is required, and we need to reconnect with that within ourselves to be a part of an ecosystem, which is always trying to reach some kind of equilibrium between these poles. I hope I'm not getting like too abstract in my thoughts here. But this is, yeah, I think, and then I also wanted to address the art, because you have showed some excellent examples of artworks in your presentation, which I find interesting. It's because there is also such an important tool to almost as a glue between all these complex thoughts and narratives, which can mediate very complex ideas and concepts in an understandable way. Yeah, I think I could probably talk forever, because I have written a few pages here in my book of thoughts, but I think I'm just going to let that do for now. And thank you for a really interesting discussion.
Let's see if Guga might have something to say. Okay, so one of the people who were invited is in quarantine, and so she's joining us on Zoom. I'm just going to read Guga's comments. Unless, Guga, you want to speak. Okay. Dear Rune, thank you for an inspiring talk. What I like particularly about this approach is the encouragement of looking for different worldviews in our own traditions instead of cultural appropriation of other indigenous traditions. I met the Danish witch and author Andreas Heilskov at a conference this autumn, and she emphasized this a lot. She has also been working on this theme of reviving our traditions in the search for a different kind of worldview that is more relational. P.S. No need to read this for the audience. Okay. Okay. Well, but if Guga, if you want to say something, then you can, but maybe not. Okay. Then I'll just go right ahead with myself then. Well, now I lost my what's it called? Chain of thoughts, or is it train of thoughts? Could be both. A train is a chain.
Train and chains.
Yeah. Okay, well, yeah. This year, the United Nations Environmental Program published a report called Making Peace with Nature. And in that report, it's about climate, the biodiversity crisis, and general pollution. And it says that these are three problems that are caused by the same thing and should be treated as one problem and solved together. But it also says that we cannot deal with these problems unless we change our relation to nature. We need to change how we view nature, and we need to change how we relate to it. I think this is interesting because this is at the United Nations, and this is scientists and bureaucrats and diplomats who are all have recently, and it's not just this report, it's also the IPCC and others, they've begun to speak a different language than they did just a few years ago. They are beginning to use more emotional language. They're beginning to say, like the IPCC report from 2018, I believe, that said that our society needs to change at a fundamental level. At every aspect of society has to be changed. It's not just about cutting down carbon. It's about changing everything. And now in this year, with the United Nations Environmental Program report that says we need to change even our culture, our philosophical view of nature, how we relate to nature. Everything has to change. And this is coming from the highest place of scientists and bureaucrats. And I think this is really interesting. And I also think that they've begun to use a different language, and I think we need a different language. When I'm a rational atheist, and that makes certain things difficult. If I could draw on a spiritual animist tradition of being, related to nature and stuff, then I would have more of a vocabulary. But I think that even for rational atheists, there is a feeling that certain things in nature are sacred, in lack of a better word. We need this word, sacred. We need other words too that are difficult for us to use as atheists, as like in this caught in a certain language paradigm where we can only use certain arguments, certain values, etc., and it's not capturing what we mean. Like a landscape can be like sacred because it just has really important value that you cannot put into economic terms or political terms, or so we need a different language, and therefore it's also really interesting. I think that these global institutions have started to speak in a different language. We need to change the way we relate to nature, how we view nature, and they're not giving solutions for that. And therefore, I think it's important that we, all of us, just take that challenge. And this event is like one shot at that. Can this be used to change how we view nature? We have to do everything we can. And stories, narratives, our history are part of how we view nature and how we view ourselves, because stories are a really important part about how humans think and remember things, whether we believe in those stories or not. The Aborigines in Australia who go on long migrations in deserts without any maps. And I read about how some people were like, how do you know how to navigate? Like, you go on a journey for several months, and how do you know, like, you don't have a map? Do you look at the stars? What they do is they have a story full of myths and events, and they meet gods or whatever on their way. And this story tells them, actually, it's their map. It tells them where to go. Like in the same part of the story, where in the story comes to a certain tree, there you are at that tree, and then you tell the next chapter of the story. So, and you're able to remember this story, and by remembering that story, they can remember how to navigate in the world. And that's what we all do. You don't have to actually literally believe in a story. It can still work. One of the greatest stories in philosophy is Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan. This is a story that you'll find very few academics today who would agree with that story. Most say of course it's nonsense. There's a academic sport in disagreeing with it. You can still find lots of valuable things in it, but nobody says that they agree with it, and yet it still has an effect on the world. So Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan is sort of like a opposite apocalypse. It starts with the apocalypse. In the beginning, everything was bad. There was war for all against all, and then society came. The police, the state, etc., came and established order. And the story is that if this disappears again, if the political institutions are somehow challenged, then we will all break out into war. So it's also an apocalyptic story. It's a warning about what will happen if we challenge authorities. That story, I don't think Thomas Hobbes literally believed it. He didn't believe that there was once upon a time a historical state of nature. But he is explicit that he wants this story to be told as a warning because it'll have an effect on people. Reading stories affect us. Literature affects us emotionally and thereby in our bodies. If you read the same story many times, you might know that it's just a myth, but it'll still work on your body. And if you read a story like Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan about how no human can be trusted, everybody's just out to get you, and so therefore we need the political institutions because we cannot trust each other. We need to be kept in check. If you read that story, you might know that the historical account of there was a state of nature and then they created the state and political institutions. You might know that that's not how things happened, but it will affect how you behave how you relate to other people. The story still impacts you. And that story has a real, even if no academic believes in Thomas Hobbes and they all have a sport in disagreeing with him, it's still the most widely believed story in our society. Political institutions believe in it, the police believes in it, and it's being retold and retold and retold. Hobbes says that this story needs to be retold in schools, etc. And today it is being told in what I mentioned in the beginning, in our stories about the apocalypse, about there's so many TV shows, movies, books, etc., that are about the breakdown of political institutions because of some environmental event. And then what happens? Everybody starts fighting everybody. It's chaos. It's the state of nature. This story this is Thomas Hobbes' story, and it's being told over and over. And my point with that is that right now we need a story, a different story about the end of the world. Because I think we do need a story about the end of the world, and not as in everything is doomed and the planet will burn, but as in society must change. The IPCC report makes that clear. Like, all aspects of society needs to change if we are to prevent the climate disasters. So we do need stories about social change. But they cannot be the story of Thomas Hobbes or the story of The Walking Dead or all the other TV shows and cultural tropes that are just variations of Thomas Hobbes. We need different stories, stories that can inspire us to trust and work together and care for each other and care for the earth. And that's why I think literature, and whether it's old sagas, whether it's myths, whether it's myths that are created right here and now by Hollywood, they all have an effect whether or not we believe in them. And therefore it's really important to interrogate them and say, what can we do with it? And how can we create different stories? That's my 2 cents.
So my name is Emil. I'm from philosophy, as well as Ole and Sigga and Gugga, who's on the screen. I'm a PhD student. I'm currently writing my thesis, and I'm working in the field of ecophenomenology. So I would claim that ecophenomenology is the kind of engaged philosophy that might help us to relearn some of the things that we have lost, that we used to know in older traditions, animist traditions. So the kind of animism that I'm interested in is how can we learn to view the world in these kinds of ways, as opposed to viewing the world as fundamentally dead. So just very broadly, my thesis is called Living Well in a Dying World, and it begins from this theory, or I take it as a fact, that we can understand modernity as basically this cataclysmic schism between those who fundamentally see the world as dead, and I call that dead naming, which is upon on, I call that dead seeing, which is upon on dead naming. So when you use a trans person's old name as opposed to honoring their chosen name. So I call it a dead seeing, which is the phenomenological way of understanding how we fundamentally as society just begin by viewing everything as dead, because if you see something as fundamentally dead, inert, a resource, then you inherently can't kill it. So how come we can kill the world so easily? It's because we don't recognize it as alive to begin with. So that's the first thing. That's sort of my take on animism, and then trying to work with how we can try to mend that in our modern imperial societies. My reactions to Rune's talk, I had, I think, 3 main questions. One of them is related to this concept of ontological violence, which I'm also very interested in. I think you touched upon that without maybe using those words. The second thing is this difference between oral culture and written culture. So in many of the indigenous traditions that we like to work with, I guess, when we talk about animism, we talk about the oral culture, we recognize that as fundamentally oral cultures. And I'm interested when we try to bring it back to Norse culture, northern cultures, the difference between, well, how and I'm no expert in that area at all, but how much of an oral culture do we actually have here, or do we have left? So I mean, Edda culture is written culture, so, and when did that change happen from, I mean, presumably there was a time when the Eddas, or the myths, the poems, were purely in oral form, and I would be interested just to learn more about when that change happened, and did it have something fundamentally to do with the change from engaging the world as fundamentally alive to engaging it as something dead. Because the written word, fantastic as I also think it is, it's also recognized to be a fundamental power instrument. It can be at least an instrument for the people in power, the people who write history. So that's a basic claim. The third thing I wanted to mention was, I think I forgot that. Yeah, I can't remember. Maybe it will come to me in a Q&A session afterwards. Thanks for listening.
I think everybody has. Do you want to say something closing points?
Hey, thanks so much for all this. It was totally a cliche to use Descartes as an icon on the de-animating agenda, dead seeing. I should have chosen something else, for sure. Cool. I'm just going to speak a little, try to formulate some of the thoughts that I got from all these different comments or criticisms. A really important word, I think, came from Vidar, and that is dialoguing. What I'm trying to do with this is dialoguing, and that requires that you reach quite far towards the actual listener, and that requires appeal, runes and stuff. Or are you then appealing to stuff like nostalgic image of the distant past? Perhaps. Is that dangerous? Oh yes. It keeps me awake at night. It seriously does. I'm like almost paranoid about it. But I think that when we talk about the way that we engage stuff like this, we're doing it through layers of dialoguing. I totally feel like an imposter even standing when I was preparing this. Oh my God, I'm going to speak about the Völuspá in Iceland. I almost feel of apologizing for it. My own background, actually my church background is Grundtvigianism, which is strongly romanticist, national romanticist Christianity in Denmark, for those of you who don't know it, who in fact saw the Eddas and sees, perhaps some even today, sees the Eddas as the Old Testament, the prelude to Jesus. So they were jumping over their own shadows to see Jesus foretold in the Elder Edda and that kind of stuff. In this dialoguing, I think it's that can also mean that it can become difficult to work with complexity. A word like animism is super problematic. So is shamanism. So is Viking. But when you want to, for instance, reach an audience, and then you need to take a choice, and that I think I'm doing quite a lot of that, and maybe I'm getting also caught up in it a little bit. So sometimes you are perhaps missing some of the complexity. Animists regularly destroy their own environments. That's a super normal thing. You see it, Iceland is a really good example. You see the same in the Easter Islands. The Maya destroyed their environments. In fact, there are natural historians who are talking about the eradication of the post-ice age fauna that basically say you see two things happening in every single continent around the earth, and that is that there start being arrowheads in the ground in the earth, and then all the big mammals disappear. The keystone species, when they disappear, the biodiversity just goes. The loss of big animals are a greater loss for the entire biodiversity system than the loss of a butterfly or something like that. Sometimes you see humans then trying to amend for that. Aboriginal Australians burn their ground in certain patterns in order to try to amend for that. So animism that I'm suggesting, it's important to not understand it as like a magic pill that would just like poof solve our problems. I think it's more a way of thinking, and it's important that it in some way both links with tradition, also in these kind of visual and appealing ways, yet also moves us away from, for instance, LARPing ideas of the past, and particularly identitarian ones. You were talking about alterity or otherness, and I think a main theme in how to create self-image in animism is that it is non-identitarian. You are creating self-image by for instance, seeing kinship with something other, where identitarianisms typically see an interior essence, a culture, a blood, a race, or something like that. And these are the kinds of things. When I, for instance, have been introducing a flag with a raven on it and stuff like that, I have been working very, very hard in all ways to avoid it becoming identitarian, and it's so important to acknowledge that almost the risk of these things. When we're talking about the Völuspá, like some of us were talking about in the coffee break, millenarism, that is a strong medicine. That is ISIS-style kind of religiosity. It's a dangerous thing. We are also moving towards one of the biggest history in catastrophes in the history of life, So this is just a little bit about how I think about relationalism, dialoguing and complexity in these things. Romanticisms, for instance, appeal to romanticisms. I did some of this work on folkloric seasonal traditions. When I remember when I first read all this stuff, a lot of it came from a scholar called Axel Ulrich, who was in fact a Nazi, it doesn't mean that he doesn't also describe some interesting things, but it just means that when I was reading it, I saw this strong sort of. It's difficult to not get these sort of Heimat sort of associations on all these May Day celebrations and all that stuff. But there's also a node in these romanticisms and nostalgias, for instance, I think that is perhaps driven by, as Völvik embodied Sophia, recognition that we are moving towards a gigantic planetary catastrophe in the existence of life. And I think that, and another aspect that perhaps I should have emphasized a little bit more in the purpose of this is that when we're talking about eco-activism, people who are trying to counter Extinction Rebellion and so on, I think there is a fundamental problem in the way they do it, that they don't have a past. Unless you are Sami or Inupiaq or another indigenous population, you don't have a past in your eco-activism. People therefore speak eco-activism only in present and future. Eco-activism is being spoken only in those two, and it's being spoken in this language that consists of topsoil erosion and methane release and global tipping points. That language has failed. Perhaps it is the most abysmal failure of communication in the history of the human species, because we've known it for 50 years that the world is coming to an end, and we have done nothing. I think the importance of using mythology, it is the reason, or perhaps it is the reason that we got so far, is that they did not use songs of power and ancient myths and history that they did not bring that into. Maybe, yeah. It's just a consideration. Cool. I think that's all I have to say. Cool. Is Ole there? Not right now. Okay. Maybe I should just go on talking.
Maybe we can just open a discussion.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good idea.
Unless you want to say something more.
No, I think.
Yeah. Why don't you stand up there? Since Ole is not there. Maybe you can just guide the discussion.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Somebody has to be there.
Just to comment on your last comment, there are some good examples of the pipeline and water right fighters. Just to emphasize your point that those movements that precisely have a background have in recent times been the most successful ones. And it brought me to remember my third point that I forgot before, which was I wanted to ask you about how you see some of the things that are coming from precisely what I call the hegemonic or death culture, the imperial culture, which could actually help us become more animist in a way. So I'm thinking about things like science, these new sciences that recognize the mycorrhizal network between trees, like trees talking, other trees communicating. So these new kind of sciences that actually help to counter the sort of the trend that science, very broadly speaking, has been, the end of the animist way of the animist point of view. And similarly in law, the movement of beside laws and of ascribing personhood to things like rivers and individual insects and stuff. I just recently had the cities where they honor, where they ascribe citizenship to all the way down to insects. So, just that was more of a question.
The whole science of mycelia between trees and all that stuff, that is not something that I know a lot about. In terms of science, I think when you think animism and when you think traditional knowledge or moving into traditional ways of knowing again, I think one of the most important things would probably be to not move into sort of, what do you call it, anti-civilizationalism or anti-technology, where you suddenly start saying, okay, technology is bad or something like that. I think that would be an important thing to make sure that you don't move into that. What was the last thing you said?
It's sort of the analysis thing in law.
That I find that extremely interesting, and I think that it is something that that could also have an important impact in Northern Europe, because there's some sort of a tradition of law as particularly important. or at least as a counter to personal rulership or something like that. Many of the Aboriginal Australians, they also have this idea of law as the very foundational cornerstone of societies that are, I think, extremely egalitarian, actually, kind of regulated by law, and these laws are bounded in the land. I think some of these proverbs that talk about that you build land with law or something like that, like in med lag skal land byggas, these kind of proverbs, they might reflect, or perhaps it is possible to uncover animist perceptions of law inside those that could be dialogued into, be used in a similar ways as the Aboriginal Australians. It might not necessarily only mean you build a state with law. Maybe it means the law should grow from the land. Or maybe we can make it mean that. Maybe we can uncover such meanings in it.
Yeah, there are a few things that came to mind, but I really appreciate just generally going into these directions, particularly finding deeper comparisons and speculations between the pre-Christian Nordic culture with other either pre-Christian or, I don't know, maybe it's like, is it maybe almost like post-Christian, or this culture that you were among in Brazil, like they form a culture in a reaction towards the enslavement by Christians. But okay, that's besides my main point. My main criticism of this idea of using the symbolism and like the story and the emotional impact of Ragnarök as likening it to the climate crisis and the ecological crisis is really that, to me, I think you can just as well see Ragnarök, particularly in Völuspá, as a positive event. It's like you can see it as what has to happen in order for the rebirth of the earth and for Baldur to come back. Okay, and this is like maybe there's not the time to explain it fully, but I tend to interpret Völuspá personally more as a psycho-spiritual myth, that it is about the death and rebirth of the ego that is inevitable given the being repressed by society this is something we have to be in a way. We have to repress some of our impulses and so on in order to become socially functional, but that it is possible to transcend that into a better state where you don't have to choose between like just being antisocial, like the feminist wolf is becoming, or the gods feel that he is becoming that, or being repressed. But yeah, this is my main argument, that unless you're like a primitivist or some sort of a misanthrope or a nihilist that thinks it's a good thing that we have a climate catastrophe and almost everybody dies and then maybe nature can start flourishing again, unless you have that kind of perspective, I don't really think maybe Völuspá fits very well as a tool to fight for climate justice, because at least I see Ragnarök as a very positive thing, really, in the end.
This reminds me of another thing that I actually wanted to just answer, and that was my jump from anthropology to myth reading. My understanding of myths is based on actually working with myths in those settings. And this is, of course, in history of religions, anthropology-based way of understanding myths, where, for instance, a myth, what a deity is. If you have a war god that's called Ugun, and when he's dancing, he's doing like this, and that single movement of the hand can both symbolize his destructive capacity when he goes berserk and he kills a whole village, and it can be his fundamental creating capacity where he's clearing the land with a machete to open civilization. There are huge contradictions inside myths, I think, and sometimes they are related to rituals. Sometimes they create relation by giving us a conceptual structure to do something specific. So you can call Ogun, you can call him a protective father, a force of nature, a Catholic saint, a symbol of black empowerment, a child that human priests need to rear so he can find himself and become real in the cult. He's a rapist that takes the human in possession. Such contradictory images, and this is my part of mine. But all these images, they create relating in different ways and in different situations. Now, and this is kind of the background for my way of doing an analysis of myths. Now, what you are suggesting is one analysis of Völuspá myth, and I think it's fully valid. You are using the myth to create relation to your life through it. But such interpretations should be allowed to coexist in total contradiction of each other. And I don't think that your reading of the Völuspá actually disproves many other readings. Völuspá as a cyclicity, Völuspá as an initiatory complex, and so on and so forth. So different engagements with a myth such as this are totally, definitely possible and fully legitimate, I think.
May I make a brief comment? Because I didn't criticize your leap from between anthropology to myth reading, but from anthropology to text reading. It's the textuality, the interpretation of texts, which I felt that you needed to have a reflection on.
Yeah.
But I'm not criticizing that you are doing myth reading, which is a part of being an anthropologist.
Okay. Cool.
Can I add one story? Because Ole was asking for stories. And actually, my notes were so messy that I forgot one point that I wanted to mention, and that's animism. And because what's going on in modern science right now is actually like in quantum physics. If you ask our quantum physicists what quantum physics is, they usually say they don't know. And in biology, for instance, there's a lot of things going on that are hard to explain, and there is probably not that great distance between some animistic conceptions and some ideas, some results, and some knowledge produced by quantum physics and biology. But I want to tell a story about a biologist inspired by Sigríður's Me Too rewilding thoughts. There's a woman, a Canadian biologist, whose name is Susan Simard. Anyone familiar with her? She's a biologist. She's works in forestry, and probably you've heard the stories, theories about communication between trees. The wood wide web. Probably Simard is the one who came up with this, was the first one who got to come up with this theory. But she was a young, aspiring scientist in the early 1990s in Canada, working within a totally male-dominated forestry science, And then she realized, or she discovered that using, poisoning trees, using Roundup, regarding everything as weeds and growth that would compete with the trees that they were going to utilize, she realized that it was all wrong, that there was no use using Roundup, and she describes in a wonderful new biography called Looking for the Mother Tree, Finding the Mother Tree. She describes when she was giving her first lectures about the results of the uselessness of using Roundup. And then later on, she got very much attention, and she was in a radio interview and a media interview, and she said quite spontaneously, it's as much using Roundup as painting some words on the rocks. And she tried to stop the journalist from quoting her with this, but the journalist did. So she was. It was very close that she would be fired, but she quit, and she was offered a position at the university instead of the Forestry Research Institute in British Columbia. So and then she discovered these. The network by mycorrhizal fungi, champions, and all the small threads that bring nourishment between trees, even between species. And after that, she discovered the communication between trees, between different species, etc., etc. So this is just one wonderful story about how things that people probably some decades ago have defined as a kind of superstitious rubbish, that we have a story here about new knowledges that really resemble animism. So I just want to share this story.
Well, I have a question for Ole. I like very much what you said in the outset, that the UN instances are calling for some way of speaking differently, telling different stories. And I think the animist narrative we're hearing here today is also asking for that. And it's more than having processions on Strøið before Christmas. I think it's something deeper needed. And it's a way of talking in a different way, not only talking about stuff. That's what we do as scientists. We're always talking about theories, this is said there. As if we're not part of the story. We are part of what is happening here. We are part of climate change. We are in it. How can we speak about it as scientists and animists?
Well, I'm not sure I have an answer for that. I think I feel like the UN is posing an open question to all of us. This is the highest international body that we have, and it's given us all a task, and we have to play an experiment. I don't think animism has to be the solution. I don't think, there's many, we have to do everything we can and see what works. And I don't know what the answer is. The thing is, none of us do. The General Secretary of the UN is frustrated. The climate scientists and scientists working with biodiversity, they all just take biodiversity. From the concept was created in the 1980s, and it was a wildly successful concept. You had multiple conferences. It only took a decade for it to be taken up at the UN level. All countries got their own laws on biodiversity. We have international bodies monitoring biodiversity. Millions of dollars were put into funds for researching how to prevent the biodiversity loss. And in that same period, the decline of biodiversity exploded and accelerated. All the theories, all the research, all the science, all the laws didn't stop it from going the exact opposite way of what was intended. And we're in a bit of the same situation now with climate change. And I think scientists are really frustrated about this. And therefore they're trying to appeal to everybody, philosophers, literature, art, like all of it, everything in the cultural sphere too, to try to find new ways, try to find something that works, because we don't have anything that works. So let's experiment with everything. And so I don't know what the solution is. The goal is just, let's try to look at everything. Yeah. And I think that's the spirit that we try to do when we make this event. This is just one voice, one thing that maybe. Let's see what we have here. Do you want to say anything? Yeah. So I think maybe there are others who want to say something, but it's 4 minutes to 5, and I think the museum is closing at 5. And there's still some coffee and cake out there if anybody wants something. And then we can maybe just chat.
Comment just about this adopting animism as a worldview. So and how, for anybody who is curious or wants to talk about it in this way, how do you relate it to just the basic philosophical questions of the relation between mind and matter to begin with? Because to me it seems like you cannot really be an animist unless you at least adopt some form of panpsychism and seeing that there's subjectivity, and I mean this just totally literally, there is actual subjectivity inherent even in subatomic particles. And then when they form complex systems like a living body, it somehow works together and we start recognizing it as consciousness. But how are you going to know this scientifically? I don't know. And everybody is kind of stuck in this assumption, which I think is an assumption that consciousness just sort of appears and but it doesn't really, mean anything. There is no spirit.
I could give one answer, and I think maybe Rune can give another one. Because I think, to relate it to what I said before about you don't have to believe in the story rationally in order for the story to still work on you. You're still acting as if you believe in the story while you're denying it. That is a thing that we do all the time. And you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it's often one interpretation of Christianity is that you have to literally believe in the resurrection of Christ in order to be a proper Christian. But for many indigenous people, you don't have to literally believe it. It's about what you are acting. The indigenous American native philosopher, Kyle P-I-W-E, I actually don't know how to pronounce it, Kyle Pi something White, sorry. He's written a lot on climate change and the Anthropocene and how it relates to indigenous practices, because he's we have actually already gone through the apocalypse. We're living in when they were uprooted and moved and their society collapsed. So the Anthropocene is not something new for them. It's not something in the future. But he's also written about, there's one text he's written called Indigenous Science Fiction, which is about when what he says is that when we are, say, communicating with our ancestors and descendants, like there's this thing where the call upon the ancestors and upon the future generations, we don't have to literally believe that we're communicating with them. What it does is that it changes our being in the world here and now. Like it changes how we are acting now by thinking about what would our ancestors say and what will our descendants say. That gives us an ethical obligation in the here and now. I think that is also what an author like Andres Nye is doing when he, in the story of Time and Water, is trying to make a generational link between his grandmother and his daughter and her future generations, and trying to create an intergenerational thinking that is a story, but that story affects you in the here and now because it gives you a different sense of time and gives you a different sense of ethical obligations to the world. Yeah. So I don't think you have to believe in literal panpsychism. You can, of course, but to think what does this rock want? You don't have to literally believe there's elves in the rock, but it still comes from maybe that elf is a representation of you having a feeling that this rock is super important. Like there's some meaningful thing here in this rock. When what I'm talking about is when we in Iceland have like that elves can prevent a construction project, or it has to drive around them. I don't know if the people literally believe that there's an elf there, but I think the elf represents because we lack the language, as I said before, to say something important.
It's also about like a living history
Mm.
of that rock, and also
Yeah.
because we started talking about microorganisms, and I really wanted to go into that before also, because that is also, of course, a direct animism to, material that we perhaps would perceive as dead. So that maybe might be a biological bridge there to.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch that.
I think we need to.
Yeah, I do think we have to close.
Very soon.
Step down.